Daniel, thanks a ton for doing this, and welcome back to New Mexico in Focus.
Absolutely, always excited to be here.
I'd like to begin with a bit of a rewind. It has been 10 months now since the end of the DOJ consent decree with APD. From your perspective, how successful was that long effort to fix a police department that could not find the Constitution with a flashlight and a roadmap?
I think one of the things that folks in Albuquerque who've been longtime advocates for police reform said before the consent decree, during the consent decree, and now after the consent decree is that this was never a box checking exercise. This was never about just fulfill a couple, technical legal requirements and everything's good. What it's always been about is transforming a pattern and practice and culture of egregious large-scale rights violations into a culture of constitutional policing. So I think that's the yardstick that we should be measuring by. We've certainly seen good things come out of the consent decree since the consent decree ended. Overall use of force in Albuquerque by APD has been trending mostly down. That's good news. Although, during one of the years that the consent decree was in force, they had one of their deadliest years on record. I think what still remains to be seen is that piece about culture change. Has the fundamental culture, has the fundamental approach to what it means to create and defend community safety changed at APD? I think that's still an open question for me and for a lot of people.
Gotcha. So given that the ACLU and other community advocacy groups still have that as an open question and maybe are still waiting for that final puzzle piece to kind of fall into place, how important are these two leadership roles at APD and finally accomplishing that, sort of divorced from who got them? How important are those two positions to finally getting to that spot?
I think they're important. I don't think they're everything. I think having a chief in place, having a public safety director in place who really share the values of the consent decree, who see that task of constitutional policing not as a 10-year to-do list that they've accomplished, but as something that they want to embody throughout their tenure and throughout the organization. That's really vital. Having folks in those positions who care about our rights, who care about real solutions to community safety, who understand that policing is not the solution to all of our problems, that those things are really important. You can have the best, most transformative chief in the world, and that's not going to do everything for an agency. And so I don't want to sort of say, Chief Barker, all of APD culture change is now on your shoulders, but it's certainly a fundamental piece of the puzzle. It's not going to be one person who fundamentally transforms policing in Albuquerque forever and ever. Amen.
Got you. You mentioned her last name. Mayor Keller has appointed Cecily Barker to that position of APD chief. She has spent 20 years of her career in law enforcement at APD, sort of the definition of an insider. I wonder, given kind of what folks like you and who have been monitoring APD for such a long time are hoping for in terms of really changing that culture, taking those last steps, how does it strike you that someone who's been there for such a long time is now going to be in that role? Is an insider the right person for that job?
I think certainly anyone who's sort of made a hiring decision understands there's always this conversation about an internal hire, external hire. Certainly the stakes are pretty high when you're talking about a police chief. And I can appreciate that there are pros and cons both ways, including on the culture change argument. Someone who's been embedded in APD culture very deeply knows.
Seen it 15 years ago when it was at its worst.
Exactly, very much knows where the things that are in need of transformation are, one would hope. What I hope the mayor was taking into consideration when he made the decision to promote an entrenched leader in APD is exactly this question. Is this the person who, on the basis of their experience and temperament and skills, can lead the department into building on the progress that they made and improving on the things that they didn't necessarily improve on during the consent decree process.
What will you be watching for to measure that in terms of her actions, her decisions on personnel and policy? Are there specifics that you're looking for that will either increase that hope or dash it on the rocks?
I think, one of the things that we heard a lot as the consent decree was winding down and when the consent decree was finally terminated was that this wasn't going to be the end of all of the reforms that were made, that the policies that were adopted were largely going to stay in place, the changes to training were largely going to stay in place, that the reporting mechanisms that the independent monitor was fulfilling were going to be replaced. And to a certain extent, all of that has stayed in place. We have seen some changes to, for example, the use of force policy suite that undid some consent decree era policies. But I think that's one of the things that we're looking for really closely is, are we going to see a slow or fast dismantling of those things that we were promised were going to carry over from the consent decree? That's huge.
Let's move on to Raul Buhanda. Chief Barker will be the first APD chief in 15 years who won't report directly to the mayor. Mayor Keller has resurrected this sort of long forgotten position of public safety director. Mr. Buhanda will oversee APD, ACS, and AFR. He comes from the FBI, of course, so unlike Chief Barker, he is kind of the definition of an outsider. That said, he knows APD quite well, both from working with them on cases and prosecutions, those kinds of things, and also in investigating the police department through the course of the DWI corruption scandal. What challenges and opportunities does kind of his background and profile present for him in terms of going forward in that role?
I think for me, for us at the ACLU, for almost everyone I talk to in the community, the DWI corruption scheme that went on for decades in not just APD, but multiple law enforcement agencies in central New Mexico really shook the confidence in law enforcement that for many of us was already pretty shaky to begin with. And so having someone coming in who's going to be overseeing APD, having this sort of high-level position, who knows the details of that, knows what happened, knows what went wrong, hopefully knows what can be changed. Best case scenario, that's really good news for rebuilding public trust, and that he can really leverage that perspective and, as you say, his sort of outsider perspective to really double down on rooting out corruption, rebuilding public trust, proving to those of us in the community who have reason not to believe that APD always has our best interests and our rights at heart that we're mistaken. I think one of the challenges will be is if that outsider perspective is dismissed by entrenched power bases within the department. We know that that's been a challenge in the culture change arena already. And certainly the perspective and information that he has from his last position could be a boon. One can imagine concerns about conflicts of interest and confidentiality and what can be disclosed and whatnot. If that becomes sort of a morass where he can take less action than he might otherwise be able to, that could be potentially concerning. But I think it remains to be seen how that will unfold.
What are some of the things that have troubled you in terms of the Keller administration's approach to the unhoused population in Albuquerque, and how might the new public safety director address some of those concerns?
I think this is a great example of saying one thing. I love some of the things that Mayor Keller said last year during the campaign about not pursuing cruel policies towards homelessness and really wanting to invest in things that work. And as you say, we can't arrest our way out of these problems. Those are right on the money. And they're where I think many New Mexicans and many Burqueños already stand. Unfortunately, the day-to-day reality that we're seeing is that that's not the city's actual policy and practice. Really stunning report from ProPublica came out about a month ago detailing just how much the city's aggressive criminalization of homelessness and of acts of survival by unhoused people skyrocketed last year, pretty consistently for a while now. Close to half or more than half of the folks at MDC live on the streets. And we're seeing massive increases in...
That's the county jail,
at
MDC.
the Metropolitan Detention Center, thank you. And we're seeing massive increases in filings of charges and arrests for things like trespassing and obstructing sidewalks, charges that are not, they're not charging you with being homeless, but those charges are just associated with living in public as a homeless person.
Who else gets charged for blocking a sidewalk?
Exactly. It's not a super common charge in other contexts. At the ACLU, we have active litigation against the city related to the policies towards unhoused people, related to encampment sweeps and things like that. And we hear stories close to a daily basis about just tragic situations where people are having their possessions destroyed and thrown away, where people are being hauled off to jail just for trying to live in the way that's available to them. And so I think whether or not the new chief and the new public safety director represent a new approach to those issues is going to be really huge for us assessing how successful they are at matching what the administration says versus what the administration has done. And you mentioned Albuquerque Community Safety, ACS. It's really encouraging to have someone whose job it is going to be to coordinate between those two agencies. One thing I hear constantly is folks who say, I love being able to call ACS when something is happening in my neighborhood. I don't love that even when I call ACS, a cop with a gun still comes. And so hopefully being able to make sure that the right responders are going to the right calls is something that will improve with this new role, or not new role, but revived role.
Daniel Williams, thank you so much for coming in to help us understand from a little different perspective these new leadership positions.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.